Day 4 of World War One, or what at the time was known as the Great War. The Great War involved fighting in the colonies as well. That's how it ended up being called the World War. And our question is, to what extent did the Great War affect Africa? Did it affect the Askaris and the civilians, especially focusing on East Africa? Just a little reminder, we have a bunch of colonies controlled by various countries at the time of World War One. Belgians control the Congo, the Germans control this area in Eastern Africa, most of which is today Tanzania. The French are in Madagascar, the British are in South Africa, the Portuguese, all these places are controlled by European countries. Let's recap the stuff that we've previously talked about in this unit. In the last lesson, we learned about trench warfare. We learned about how it developed as a stalemate on the Western Front, west of Germany, not west of France, but west of Germany. In the trenches, life was pretty terrible. In no man's land, everything was pretty tragic. It was destructive of people, animals, trees, life generally. The only life that did very well from this were rats and vultures and crows who eat dead bodies. This cartoon here in the middle shows us sort of kind of the race to the sea. It also sort of shows us where the trenches are, the German and the French. And this is a picture of the French, in theory, punching the Germans into Belgium. So let's do a little orientation in East Africa. And we're not going to spend as much time on this as is probably warranted, but we'll give it enough of an overview so you understand why. The Maji-Maji War happened in the colonies of German East Africa. Why did it happen? So we're rewinding to 1905, 1907, and the question is, why did this war happen? The fast version of why this happened is that the German government took over this area as a colony and tried to establish cotton plantations to export cotton as a cash crop. This led to widespread famine across the many nationalities of the region, and many of these groups, like the Wahehe and the Indingo and the Ngoni, rebelled. They didn't want to be stuck working for the Germans on plantations. So these different groups that today make up Tanzania, you have the Tanzanian symbol up here, they fought back and they created a war against the German troops. This war also involved quite a bit of animist religious magic. There was a belief that the soldiers on the Maji-Maji side, on the Tanzanian side, would be immune from the bullets of the Germans through their religion and their religious magic and the power of their religion. They would be protected from the bullets. The German bullets would just turn into water. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and hundreds of thousands of the people of what would become Tanzania were gunned down. As a result of this 2-year war, 250,000 Tanzanian casualties, and also another untold number of prisoners of war were taken. As opposed to on the German side, the German Schutztruppe, there were 15 casualties. So 250,000 casualties versus 15, plus an untold number of prisoners. Why did this happen? The Germans wanted to create a colony there. The Germans wanted to create plantations there, and the people of Tanzania were resisting. As a result of that war, there was more famine. As a result of the war, there was more famine. This leads us to the question of who are the Askaris, because they are part of what we're talking about here. Who are the Askaris? The Askaris are German soldiers, but they are Black Africans. Askaris is the Swahili word for soldier. Askaris were Black African soldiers in the German military, in the German colony of Eastern Africa. German propaganda made these Askari soldiers seem like a pretty amazing loyal group. Um, they made battle and war in Africa seem more civilized than it was in Europe. But in reality, while the white officers may have treated each other with sort of gentlemanly respect, the Askari soldiers were not treated very well at all. So, who were the Askaris? Why would you sign up to be a soldier in the German army when the Germans had, a few years earlier, defeated your country? And the answer is that they were recruited from famine areas, quite similar to sepoy soldier recruitment in India or force publique soldier recruitment in Congo. These Askaris were recruited from one region, enticed with wages and uniforms and weapons, and then they were deployed. They were sent to fight in different regions with a different nationality. So they're not policing their own people, they're policing different nationalities within the same colony, but not their own nationality. They were, once they were in the military, encouraged or even ordered to commit atrocities. All kinds of bad things were encouraged, things from alcoholism and adultery and to theft, to arson, to rape, to all kinds of bad things. Everything from the minor to the major. All these things made it really hard for the soldiers to quit and return to civilian life. Once you were part of the Askari military and you've done some of these bad things, it's going to be really hard to return to civilian life when people know that you've done those bad things. These are some drawings on the left side of these soldiers in an idealized way. This is a photo from back then. It's been colorized, but it gives you a sense of the humanity of these soldiers. And down here, this photo is representative of the many, many atrocities. Villages were burnt down, farms were burned, people's property was taken. This is some people who are scavenging the remains of their village for some fruit from these trees. They don't have a lot left, though. This brings us to question number 3. Who was Paul von Lettalvorbeck? I always hate to talk about a white guy when we're talking about Africa, but he's a pretty darn important guy. He doesn't get talked about enough considering how terrible he is. He first served in Southwest Africa. He worked for von Trotha. If you remember, von Trotha was the guy in Southwest Africa who said all those horrible things about the Herero. He was the one that said, we'll shoot the women and the children and the people with the cows, the people without the cows, we'll shoot them all and push them all into the desert. So Paul von Lettalvorbeck, when he was a young man, worked for von Trotha, the guy who led the fight against the Herero. I point that out because it gives us an idea of the training that Lettalvorbeck had when he was a young soldier. He did so well in the war against the Herero. He impressed his superiors that he was rewarded with a promotion. He was promoted to major and later commander of the Schutztruppe in Eastern Africa. Moved over to German Southeast Africa just before the beginning of the Great War, and he was kind of given his own colony to command. He was the commander of all of the forces and the Askari in Southeast Africa, and he became known as the Lion of Africa. He had a reputation for being one of the best commanders in World War I, possibly one of the best German commanders ever, based on how much he did with so little. He decided, once he got to Southeast Africa, to violate the Congo Agreement. The Congo Agreement was a treaty where all the colonies agreed that they would not fight each other, even if war broke out in Europe. So, British colony, German colony, even if Britain and Germany fought in Europe, the British and German colonies would not fight each other in Africa, for example. Von Lettalvorbeck violated this treaty and attacked the British colony to his south because he wanted to try to distract the British from going to help the British in Europe. He wanted to distract the British, distract the Belgians, the French, later the Portuguese, and keep them busy in Africa so they couldn't support their war effort in Europe. He fought in lots of battles. He led his Askari soldiers to victory in many places. The Battle of Mahiwa is a pretty significant one where he and his troops won the battle despite being massively outnumbered. And he relied mostly on the strategy of guerrilla tactics um, because he was always outnumbered. He relied on porters on the bottom left there. Porters are the people who carry things. So rather than using pack animals or donkeys to carry things, he just relied on conscripted humans, forced labor. This should sound familiar. It's the same thing that the Belgians did in the Congo, forcing people to carry things until they dropped dead from exhaustion. He would later retire to Europe after the war. He was a hero to German people for many years, and he would disagree with Hitler later on in World War II about a lot of things. More or less, he was too extreme, even for Adolf Hitler. He retired and died peacefully in his home in the 1960s of old age. What was the war like in East Africa? So, what was all this fighting like that von Lettalvorbeck led? Well, the German Askaris, led by Lettalvorbeck, were fighting the British, the Belgians, the Portuguese, all at the same time. It was a war of movement. It was not a war of trenches. It was a war of guerrilla tactics, moving around through different terrain. Um, it was mostly foot travel because of the terrain. You can see in this map in the center, German East Africa here, Mount Kilimanjaro and mountains here, Lake Victoria here, the Congo is over here, British East Africa up here with some more mountains. It's a very diverse terrain. It's impossible to get vehicles in, trucks, cars, tanks, no go. Definitely not airplanes. Um, Very few even horses or donkeys. And because of all this, there's going to be very few engagements that involve artillery, just because it's hard to move the artillery around the country. In service of the military, we have porters again here. They are being guarded by Askari troops. You see a soldier here, and a soldier here, and a soldier here, and then the porters carrying things there. At the least, 100,000 porters died during the war, unpaid, unremembered. They were forced to do the labor, and most of them died from disease and starvation and exhaustion. After a few years into the war, by 1916, Germany was under so much pressure in Europe, there was no real way for them to get supplies down to Eastern Africa. Von Lettow-Vorbeck continued to lead his soldiers to victory without supplies, without reinforcements for another 2 years. You can see the Askaris in this picture have shoes, but up here they're barefoot. They have no shoes on. The uniforms go from being pretty nice to being effectively like a t-shirt and basketball shorts and some shin guards, no shoes. But he does the best he can with these limited supplies, and in order to get ammunition and weapons and food and things like that, he encourages his troops to cross the border into Congo, into the British East Africa, into the Portuguese colony to steal food and supplies and weapons and ammunition. In the end, he was so successful. His Askari troops remained loyal because they sort of didn't have any choices by that point. He didn't pay the troops for the last couple of years of fighting because he didn't have the money to do it with. He promised them payment after the war, but since Germany lost the war, these Askari soldiers never got paid. However, it's a pretty good record at the end. Only 6,300 Askari casualties out of the total of 30,000 who were fighting, and only 732 white German Schutztruppe were killed. Most of those deaths were due to disease and starvation, and most of them were not due to combat because of his brilliant guerrilla tactics. Okay. There, ooh, I don't know why number 2 is a different color. There's your 4 questions, and then combine them into a single summary. How did the Great War affect Askaris and civilians in East Africa?